Hi, my name is Tony Santo and I'm a large format photographer. A fellow large format photographer and viewer of my channel, John D'Angelo, liked my Graflok back adapter so much he commissioned me to make his very own adapter. So this video is all about how I made this Graflok back adapter for him. Are you working on a camera modification as well? Please leave a comment below and share with all of us. So I've got this nice piece of mahogany, what used to be part of a floor, that I'm going to turn into this back that'll support the Graflok back. The very first thing I need to do is run it through my jointer so that I get the cupping that's in this board out of it. So it's wobbly, we need a completely flat surface, and that's what this machine is going to do. So we're going to do that to one side and then we'll run it through the planer. Now that I've got a nice flat surface on the side that I just ran through the jointer, I'm going to flip it and run it through my planer so that I can get a surface that's also completely flat on the top but parallel to the side that I just ran through the jointer. So this is the wooden frame that I made for my Graflok back to attach to. Each side is 7 3/4 inches, so I'm going to use 8 inches as my guide. So 4 sides, 8 inches, that'll give me plenty of wood in case there are any mistakes along the way. So 8 times 4, that's 32 inches. I'm going to cut my wooden board down here at 32 inches, so I'm working with a smaller piece of wood, and then I'll cut the individual pieces as well. Since this is reclaimed mahogany from wood flooring, it does have a tongue and a groove on it that I'd like to cut off so that I'm working with a nice rectangular shape. As you can see, using a jointer and a planer really makes a difference when it comes to getting wood perfectly flat. There's absolutely no gap in between each of these boards. So what I'm going to do next is rip my pieces of wood down to the proper width. This particular side of the frame is 7/8 of an inch, and this particular side is 1 1/4 inches. Originally, when I made this wooden frame for my Graflok back, I made it out of an old award plaque that was hanging around that was made out of solid walnut. And all I ended up doing is punching a hole out of the center and then cutting in grooves to accept the Graflok back and to attach it to my Zone 6 camera. But that creates 4 weak points along where the grain is going in a particular direction. The grain happens to be traveling this way, which creates weak points along the edges here. So if this were to fall, it could easily snap with the grain. So it's not the strongest wooden frame. A better way to do this would be to create mortise and tenon joints, which is what I'm going to do for this particular wooden frame. So to make the tenon, what I'm going to do is make a shoulder cut here at 7/8 of an inch. Now there's going to be a little bit excess here that I'll trim off later once I get the proper dimensions down. But I just want to rough cut this and get my shoulder cut done so then I can create the tenon. Now that I've got my tenon, I need to make sure that I cut out the mortise that will accept this tenon so that we can glue these pieces together under high pressure. So what I'm going to do here is just take my razor blade and square off the tenon so that it seats properly inside the mortise so that that joint is nice and flush. So here I've mocked up my mortise and tenon frame to basically get an idea of how I should position the Graflok back onto the wooden frame. And what I'd like to do is create a recess in the frame that will accommodate the Graflok back so that I eliminate any potential light leaks that could occur from this not being seated properly. So by recessing it, this frame will sit below the wood and create a natural light trap. Here I have my wooden frame laid out with the recess that I just created, that now I can just drop that international back right in. The next thing I want to do is create a chamfer or 45-degree angle here that will allow easier access to the film holder when you're pulling the film holder in and out of the international back. So now it's time to glue this and put some clamps on it. Now that I've waited 24 hours for the glue to set up under pressure with clamps, I'm ready now to trim this down to the proper size, because there's a lot of excess here that just needs to go away, and that will smooth out all these edges into a nice square. So let's go ahead and do that. So now that we've cleaned up all these edges, we've got a nice square frame that should match up pretty closely to the other one that I made here. So there we go, nice flat surface, nice even all the way around. So that'll mate nicely with the Zone 6 camera. So what I'm going to do next is create a light trap for the rear standard. The inner part here actually protrudes outward, and the outer part is recessed so that this inner part will actually fit into a groove in the back of the bellows. So that creates a light trap when you attach the wooden frame to the camera. As you can see, I've created that recess that will fit nicely into the bellows recessed area to create that light trap. Before I can test my piece that I've cut out for the recessed light trap for the back of the Zone 6 camera, what I need to do is cut out these notches here that slip into these metal brackets so that the frame can attach to, and then the brackets slide over to hold it into place on the camera. So I've set up my wooden frame on my tenoning jig here to make sure that I get a nice 45-degree angle cut into each of the four corners.
After completing the initial cut, I remove the excess material as shown here.
So there's the slot that I've cut out that will fit into the brackets in the back of the camera to hold this rear standard back in place. Now that I've gotten my wooden frame all cut out for all the recessed areas and it fits snugly on the back of the camera, it's time to make considerations for how I'm going to mount the Graflok back to the back of the rear standard. So to do that, what I'm going to do is, since there are actually seven holes here for screws, for 6 of those holes I'm going to use these wood insert nuts that are really great because you screw them into the wood. This way you're not messing with the wood if you have to take the screws out, and the screws just simply go into the brass fitting. So I've done that for my other rear standard that I made for my Graflok back, and I really appreciate that, because if I ever have to retouch this with some fresh black paint or restain this, it makes it much easier to take off that back and basically do whatever maintenance that I need to do to that. To make it easier to put these wood insert nuts into the mahogany, what I've done is set up my drill press here so that I've got the right depth going into the wood so I don't go all the way through, but just enough so that this is flush with the inside recessed area where this Graflok back is going to sit. Now that I've got my holes drilled out to the proper depth and size, I can take my wood insert nuts and put them into the mahogany back. To do that, I've basically made a makeshift tool, because if you try to use the slots and use a slotted screwdriver to just put these in, invariably you will break the brass fitting here and you'll never get this all the way through. So basically to work around that is to just take a nut, put it onto a screw, and then thread that right into the wood insert nut. And that nut locks it down, prevents the screw from going any deeper into the wood insert nut. So now all I have to do is just take this and carefully screw this in slowly. Okay, so I ran into a couple of problems here. One was that the number of nuts that I needed on my actual screw was more than just one, so I ended up putting a few more on there to prevent the actual screw from going through to the end of the wood insert nut and popping into my wood. So I just put a series of 4 nuts on top of this. Now the other problem I had was that I ended up shearing off the top of the nut which I was using this hex key for. So I've now moved over to the socket wrench and using that to put these in. So let's see if I can do that successfully here. That went in beautifully. So now it is nice and flush with this mahogany. So let me go ahead and do the others. Getting it started is the trickiest part because you want to make sure that it's nice and level and not going in at an angle. In order for these screws to fit into the wood insert nuts that I just put into the mahogany frame, I need to drill out the Graflok back for a wider hole in order to accommodate these screws. So now these new holes will accommodate these screws for the attachment of this international back to the wooden frame. If you've watched my other videos, you know that I'm a huge fan of showing not only the good work, but also all of my mistakes in hopes that it might help others avoid making similar mistakes. So in that spirit, I'd like to talk about 4 mistakes that I made making this back. When I was routing out the recessed area where the Graflok back sits in, I didn't do a very good job of lining up all of the edges to each of the 4 pieces here, so I ended up with mismatched lines. So to correct for that, I ended up taking some scrap thin pieces of wood that I had left over from cutting down the main 4 pieces and gluing them around the perimeter with the Graflok back set in here to get a nice perfect fit. And although that wouldn't have affected the functionality, it certainly cleans up the appearance of the piece. Because I recessed my pieces prior to making my mortises, I didn't pay careful enough attention and mortised out the wrong side for the tenon to fit into. So I ended up having to mortise out the correct side, which then left me with a hole on the opposite side, on the outer edges. So to correct that, all I simply did was take the tenons that were extra from cutting down the tenons and then gluing those pieces right into the mortise. And in the end, it ended up looking pretty nice. Kind of looks like a design feature and purposefully done. One of the critical areas where I made a mistake on was these thin corner pieces here that attach to the back of the camera so that the metal slider slides over them and holds the back into place. And this is important because you don't want to have a sloppy fit because that could lead to some light leaks getting into the camera. So initially when I did this, I cut a couple of these down a little too far and it felt sloppy in the camera. So I ended up just gluing some blocks in and starting over and cutting down to the appropriate height, and now there's a nice tight fit. Another critical area for the camera to avoid light leaks is this raised area on the back side of it where the bellows attaches to. And the bellows actually have a recessed area on the Zone 6 camera so that this is supposed to fit right into that area. And initially when I made the back, I felt like this area wasn't raised enough, didn't stick out enough to fit into that recessed part of the bellows, so I ended up gluing some flat pieces of wood onto this, sanding it down smooth, and now I've got a nice tight fit that's not going to let any light leaks in. It creates a very nice light trap. After I finished sanding, I took a tack cloth and just wiped all of the dust off of this back so that I get a nice clean finish. So I'm just going to take some flat black paint and paint the interior areas that aren't supposed to have any light to them. So that's the back area where this attaches to the camera, as well as the area where the Graflok back is going to be. So I want to mask off any areas where I want to stain in polyurethane so I don't get any black color in those particular areas. I went ahead and put 2 coats of flat black paint with a light sanding in between each coat, and now I'm ready to stain all of the mahogany that you see here around the edges. And because there's 20 plus years of oxidation on the original Zone 6 camera, it's going to be pretty difficult to match at 100%. So I have found that Minwax's wood finish here, it's penetrating stain. This is an oil-based stain. The Gunstock 231 color seems to approximate the original finish about as close as you're going to get for something that old. So for this, I'm just taking an old rag, dipping it in my stain just to get a little bit of stain, and then just rubbing that finish right on. Now that I've got my piece stained nicely, I want to protect that finish with some polyurethane. This is an oil-based product that's made by Minwax. It has a clear semi-gloss finish, and that happens to be a finish that approximates the original camera finish fairly closely. What I'm going to do is apply 2 coats of polyurethane with a light sanding in between to give a very nice smooth appearance, as well as a hard protective coating on this, so that when John does go out in the field and utilizes this product, it's going to be well protected against the elements of the weather. Applying polyurethane is pretty easy. All you have to do is get yourself an old rag that's clean, of course, and dip it into the poly and just rub it on. Couldn't be any simpler. This really brings out that stain color quite nicely. So now it's time to perform a light leak test, and for that I'm going to take a flashlight and shine the flashlight around the perimeter of where the back that I made attaches to the camera. It's also important to note that I've got a film holder in the film holder slot so that I'm not shining light through the back of the ground glass and mistaking that for a light leak. At the same time, I'm also going to run the light across the bellows to make sure that my bellows don't have any light leaks as well, since it's been quite a long time since I've actually done that. So I'm going to be looking through the front of the camera to make sure that there aren't any stray light beams coming through there. Can you help me out on this one? It's time for lights out. So now I'm just going to check for light leaks by shining the light around all the grooves on the back of the camera. I'm also going to run the light up and down the bellows, making sure there's nothing there. Let me know if you guys see something. Leave a comment below. And hopefully there are no light leaks in the bellows. And that's it. As always, thanks for watching.